thanks very much, Dr. Tharoor, for joining us at a busy political time. But while political journalists speculate on the future of the UPA government and some of its ministers, tonight our focus is the future of higher education. And it's wonderful to have you with us because you've really been through, of course, through Delhi University, a graduate from St. Stephen's College, and then gone internationally to the Fletcher School of Diplomacy. An illustrious career. You went on to be Under Secretary General at the UN, and of course the author of many books as well. So thanks once again, and we've got citizens and people fascinated with the subject and stakeholders joining us from around the world tonight on this Google Plus Hangout. Also questions voted on oursay.com. We've also got questions from rural India, so I think we have an exciting 1 hour in front of us. So Dr. Tharoor, perhaps you'd like to open with your thoughts on the current state of higher education in India, especially at a time when there's much controversy over Delhi University's planned reforms.
Right, Sonia. Well, first of all, good to be with you and good to be with the those following this Google Hangout. And certainly, for me, there is no question that higher education in India is an extremely important issue for the future of our country. The fact is that we are an astonishingly young nation. Sonia, we're looking at a country where something like 560 million of our people are under the age of 25, where if you look at the key educational age of 10 to 19, we have 205 million youngsters who are in India, who are Indians. And that is key because if all goes well, this group of people could for the next 40 years be a youthful, productive, dynamic, working age population for India and for the world at a time when so many other countries around the world, including China, are aging. Our average age remains young while others are crossing the 40s. And this is tremendously important for us. It can be a demographic dividend, to use the cliche, provided, of course, we get the education part right. If we can educate our young people, if we can equip, take advantage of the opportunities and challenges that are available to the 21st century India and around the world, then we will have a tremendous success story. If we fail, and by the way, when I say we can educate them, I also include vocational training. Not everybody has to go to a college and come out with a degree. We need people who are qualified, who've learned useful trades and skills, plumbers, carpenters, masons, electricians, auto mechanics. We need all of those and more for our economy and for our society. But if we can't do both, that is, providing education and providing effective vocational skills, then I'm afraid it will turn to be a demographic nightmare. Because what we would face, I'm afraid, we're already seeing examples of, with the incidents in 165 of our 600 have turned out to be vulnerable to the blandishments of the gun, the Maoists. And if you don't want that, then education is the answer. In other words, education is not just an economic challenge for India, it is also a national security challenge and opportunity.
So I'd just like to introduce our participants this evening, and also have live tweets and reactions coming in. But I'd just like to ask our participants to introduce themselves. And Chanda Bide, perhaps we can begin with you, just a brief introductions, and then the rest of the participants. Go ahead, Ms. Bide.
Yeah, good evening, everyone. I'm Chanda Bide from Bangalore. I am a high school teacher.
Right. Shantanu Gupta, please go ahead.
Good evening, everyone, and Dr. Tharoor. I'm Shantanu Gupta, Associate Director, Center for Civil Society. Thank you.
Good evening.
Nipun Kaushik.
Hi, this is Nipun joining Google Hangout from Bangalore. I work for Oxfam India.
And we have Robert Mann also with us. Go ahead, Robert.
Good evening, everyone. Good evening, Minister. I work as an entrepreneur in New Delhi.
Saurabh Tripathi.
Sorry, couldn't hear a word from Nottingham.
Sorry. Good evening, Dr. Tharoor. My name is Saurabh. I study economics at the University of Nottingham.
Great. And Neha, आप भी आप अपना परिचय दे सकते हैं?
मेरा नाम नेहा है और मैं दिल्ली से हूँ और मैं द VIP फाउंडेशन के साथ जुड़ी हूँ.
Thank you, Neha. So a great lineup. Chanda, please go ahead with your question.
Yeah. Good evening, Dr. Tharoor.
Good evening.
Yeah, we have seen that education in our country is kind of politicized And we have seen it happening in history textbooks, we have seen it happening in the language policies, and where we have seen it most rampant, I feel, is in the reservation policy, especially for SC and ST candidates. Now what happens is the deserving candidates do feel frustrated, and then they eventually don't get any openings here in India, and they tend to leave the country. So I would like to know, what can we do to stop this?
Well, I would say, first of all, that reservation is a national policy. It's been voted by Parliament repeatedly. The Constitution essentially provides for affirmative action. And I think it's important to understand that this is our way of undoing millennia, 3 millennia perhaps, of discrimination against the underprivileged elements of our society. So that is necessary. We do need to give them an opportunity to avail of these places in schools and universities that might not otherwise have been available to their ancestors and forebears. Having said that, the best answer to prevent others from fleeing, as you suggest they are doing, is to increase the capacity in our country. Create more educational institutions, more universities with higher standards, in order to have more places available for Indian students of all backgrounds to pursue their educational dreams in India. That is very much my desire. The expansion of capacity, to my mind, is a huge priority for educational policymakers in our country. And we have tried a number of steps to do this, including introducing a number of bills that sadly have not been voted by our increasingly dysfunctional parliament, which would actually authorize the creation of new colleges and universities, including universities for research and innovation, a bill that's pending, including potentially foreign universities. We'd have a regulatory framework for them to come into India. You know, I'm very conscious of the fact not only that there are over 100,000 Indian students in America, 38,000 in the UK, another 50,000 in Australia and New Zealand, God knows how many more in how many other countries, but that even when American universities have gone off and opened campuses in places like Doha and Muscat and Kuwait and Qatar, Doha is Qatar, and Singapore, that it's not just the locals that are going, there are Indian students applying to and filling up the places in these campuses. So clearly the thrust, the hunger for education of a decent quality and of international standard is high. And I think we need to be able to provide that and multiply the number of opportunities for that in India. If there are enough places, if we're no longer worrying about a sort of economics of scarcity when it comes to higher education, then you will not need to ask that question again a decade from now.
Thank you.
Shantanu, why don't you come in here with your question?
Good evening, Dr. Tharoor. Fortunately, my question is also on the capacity. In fact, I'm seeking your comment on a solution. So my question to you is that why don't we open the higher education sector for-profit so that we can have genuine players, we can have investment, we can have a lot of choice. Because currently, because of heavy regulations and absence of investment, only people, to my mind, with deep pockets and political connections can open higher institute. See, appreciate your comment on the same.
No, I do understand your concern, Shantanu, but at the same time, you have to understand that, again, we are in the context of a set of national policies that have evolved over time. Going back to the Kothari Commission on Education in the 1960s, there has been a very strong presumption in India that education cannot be for profit. And this has actually been affirmed quite recently in 2 Supreme Court judgments in 2002 and 2005 that have specifically laid down that for-profit education is not permissible in India. So the question of any government just creating a new policy is not possible because there are court judgments as well on this matter. The second point to be made is, of course, that we are concerned already that even where for-profit education is not legal, we are finding, sadly, many private institutions gouging students unethically and illegally, capitation fees, declaring one kind of admission fee and taking more under the table, promising to pay their teachers a certain wage and actually getting kickbacks from their own teachers. All these practices appear to be happening in our country because, indeed, some people have gone into education for the purpose of making a profit. And we even have an unfair practices bill pending before Parliament that would not only outlaw those things, most of them are illegal already, but actually raise the criminalization and penalties for criminal activity on people who do this kind of thing. So what I want to stress is, your concern can be addressed in a different way. You're saying we make it possible for more investment to come into education. You're not, it has to be necessarily for profit. It's how do people motivates people to come into education. But we're trying to find creative solutions to that. An example of the Universities for Innovation Bill. This is a way of setting up innovation universities with tremendously attractive terms from the government, which can be in the private sector, in the public sector, and in public-private collaboration, PP. So in those circumstances, if the bill is passed, you would have a basic framework whereby a private sector person could come in, would be allowed to charge fees as appropriate in terms of the offered, would not be allowed to exist for profit per se, but a certain margin on their investment is permitted even under the Supreme Court guidelines. That margin can, in many cases, be plowed back into the institution and help improve its quality. So it's not so much the for-profit thing that is one, it's to get people into the system through a legislative action that will encourage them to come in and do this. And frankly, we want to see Parliament acting on the number of pending, we have 11 pending bills on higher education. If Parliament would do its job properly, we would actually have these things and create a much more hospitable environment for investment in higher education.
But Dr. Tharoor, the worry of course remains that in higher education, even given the current case, and you've seen this worry about the UGC clearing many higher institutes, which actually are basically in some way just education shops, and the quality of education, students come out with degrees which are worthless when they actually go out to get jobs. The whole issue of bribery, this is a claim made by many private institutions being rampant in UGC to get a clearance. You don't need Parliament to fix that. And what's being done to actually fix that?
We are trying to fix that. First of all, we have tried to make everything as transparent as possible. Both the UGC and the AICTE, which is the institution that approves engineering and technical institutions, for example, those are doing as much as possible now on the web. In other words, when an institution applies, the application's on the web. When an inspection committee goes out there, the names of those people and what they find is on the web. The specific deficiencies that they identify in a place they inspect are on the web, so they cannot blackmail for the sake of a bribe by saying anything that is not true, because it's published. And similarly, the action taken to overcome these deficiencies will also be on the web. The more transparent the process is, the less likely it is that corruption is possible. Now, in our country and in our world, no foolproof system exists to completely eliminate the possibility of any wrongdoing or corruption. But we are taking steps to ensure that this becomes less and less likely. A second thing that we are trying to do, of course, is to improve the process of monitoring the quality of these institutions once approved. We have, for example, in the case of the so-called deemed to be universities, established the tandem committee, which went out and inspected all of them to see if they were what they claimed to be. And in fact, the committee classified them into three categories. The A category were all blessed, as it were. The B category was some 40-odd universities, which were given 3 years to get themselves into better shape. And the C category were 44 deemed universities that were told that they did not meet the definition of a university and had to be shut down. They have all gone to court, so the matter is sub judice. But the fact is that unless the court upholds their rights, we have done our part as administrators, as education policy makers, to ensure that quality is upheld and that institutions cannot claim to be universities without maintaining a certain standard. There are other examples I could give you, but I know there are other questions. The idea is to ensure that we have accreditation policies, we have supervisory regulatory mechanisms, including appointing ad hoc committees to study quality and ensure that people are getting the education they're paying for.
Nipun Poshika, go ahead with your question.
Good evening, Dr. Tharoor. My question on higher education is on a different line. Like, I would like to ask you, would the strict implementation of Right to Education Act would close the gap between India and Bharat, as we mentioned them today, and how would it impact the higher education?
Well, at the moment, the Right to Education Act is focused principally on school education, in fact, on the ages of 6 to 14. But I'll tell you, one of the more interesting things about right to education is precisely the point you raised in your question, Nipun, that it's closing the gap between India and Bharat. That what you've got now with RTE, apart from the fact that we're pumping a lot more money into education, into the states so that they can get more kids into the system and keep them there, we are also improving infrastructure through RTE so that poor schools are getting money now to build better classrooms, to build toilet facilities, to build ramps for disabled people, to build playgrounds. So there's a lot more resources coming in that actually help the poorer schools, particularly, that need this kind of assistance. But above all, of course, is the requirement that even private schools have to accommodate 25% of their ranks with basically children from the economically and socially disadvantaged sectors of society. And that means that you will no longer have a situation where certain affluent kids get one kind of education and poor kids or rural kids get a second-rate education. The idea would be that there would be a mixture. The classroom would be much more heterogeneous. That you would actually find children of all backgrounds mingling with each other, learning from each other. And let's not assume that it's only one set that can teach the other. There's a great deal that these affluent kids can learn from the struggles and life experiences of the poorer kids. Have them together in the class, have them exchanging experiences, learning the same things, and I believe we will actually be closing the gap, that one of the many, many gaps that divide our society.
You're not worried, Dr. Tharoor, by the recent report which showed that actually the standards had fallen after the introduction of RT, so actually questioning the efficacy of RT and what it's actually achieved?
Well, that report you're referring to is a particular report issued by an NGO, which we like and admire, but there is a far more comprehensive study done, the National Assessment Survey, by the government, which takes in far more schools in a far more comprehensive manner. Unfortunately, they're much slower in releasing their results, like all government processes, so they get much less attention than Pratham's ASER report that you're referring to. Now, let me say two things about the findings of the National Assessment Survey. The first is, like Pratham, they conclude that overall levels of learning achievement are low. But unlike Pratham, they actually have been able to demonstrate a clear improvement between lower levels of learning a couple of years ago and higher levels of learning after the RTE has come in. So we're not satisfied with the result. You know, I don't remember the exact numbers, but it's something like, you know, let's say if 40% of children in the 8th grade could read at the 5th grade level, now it's gone up to maybe 50% or 48%. It has gone up, but the total number is still not good enough. We need to have, you know, 90-odd% of 8th grade children reading better than 5th grade level, for God's sake. But I'm just saying that at least the progress is in the right direction. There is a lot of distance yet to be traveled, but the fact definitely remains that we, in a very detailed, comprehensive nationwide survey, which is more than the ASER survey is, we have demonstrated that while learning achievements are low, there has been progress, measurable progress in improving the levels in recent years.
Right. In fact, since we're talking about the whole India and Bharat conundrum in a way, let me just go across, because RSA also teamed up with Gram Vani to source questions from its rural mobile network called Gunj. And our first question, which I'll read out, is from Parmeshwar Kumar Chauhan, who's 23 years old, from Dhanbad. He asked, English is an international language which is required at every step in the globalized world. However, all the government schools of Jharkhand are Hindi medium. There's no facility for the students to inculcate good English reading, writing, and conversation skills. Since it is the right of the children to get quality education that helps them make progress and move ahead in this competitive world, how can this challenge be overcome, especially as most of India resides in rural areas? Now, you raised this issue about English in Kerala recently as a politically sensitive subject language, but how do you actually plan to tackle this?
Look, I agree completely with young Parameshwar from Dhanbad, because the fact is that while there is a very strong argument to be made for education in one's mother tongue, so that people grasp ideas and concepts and information more readily, there is obviously also an argument for a second language to be taught meaningfully. Whether it's English in a Hindi medium school or Hindi in an English medium school, the quality of language instruction has to be improved. Because you have to ask yourself, you know, not one size fits all. There will be many students who will come out of a Hindi medium school and go into professions or lives in which they'll use only Hindi the rest of their life. But there are some who have other aspirations. And for example, I was talking to a professor, a former professor from Jawaharlal Nehru University in Delhi, and he was telling me how sad it was. There were bright students who had come out from a Hindi medium education, had the ability to get into JNU, but just didn't have the English to understand the lectures. And you know, it's difficult to expect a lecturer from a different part of the country who has done all his study, let's say a lecturer in constitutional theory, has probably never read a textbook in Hindi in his life. How do you expect him to convert his lectures into Hindi, especially if he's not from the Hindi-speaking parts of India? He is there and he's got his job to lecture in English. And suddenly we find that this poor kid from Jharkhand sitting in JNU is not able to learn because his education has not equipped him, even with the second language level of English required, to grasp these postgraduate lectures. Now that worries me. I think we have to really, really strengthen the teaching of English in non-English medium schools and the teaching of Indian languages in English medium schools. I must say, I picked up far more Hindi in 3 years as a student at Delhi University than I learned in 12 years of classroom Hindi, because languages are so badly taught in our classrooms. So I have a fundamental personal sympathy for those who say that language skills must be taught, and I'm a passionate believer in that. I would like to see much greater improvement in language teaching, as I said, including English language teaching.
Right. I'm just going to ask also questions coming in live. We have Vishal Singh Deo, who's written in on Google Plus, saying that, sir, your support towards the 4-year undergraduate program of Delhi University is disturbing. The program does not have the consensus of students and academics. The Vice Chancellor has done little to creating an environment that enables a fair discussion. Rethink your decision about the 4-year program and reach out to the voices that are being silenced. And of course, newspaper reports, even the Prime Minister is puzzled at the hurry with which this program is being pushed through. Why do you support it, Dr. Tharoor?
First of all, let me stress it is not my decision. The decision to go for a 4-year program is taken by the university. It is completely within the prerogatives of the university, and it has gone through the normal procedures required for an academic decision. The position I took, which I thought I made very clear in my one interview on the subject to the press, was that it was inappropriate for me as a minister to overrule a university which is doing what a university is allowed to do. I don't think in principle that it is healthy for our educational system for a politician, or for that matter a bureaucrat, to tell a vice chancellor what he or she should be doing academically. That would set a very dangerous precedent. What we can do as the ministry under whose aegis all this is happening is to make sure that all due processes are followed. And we have been given a very convincing account of the due process and of the rationale for this change, including, by the way, a decision taken by the Academic Council many years ago, I believe in 2008, followed by an extensive series of consultations by the new Vice Chancellor, followed by a decision of the Academic Council by an overwhelming majority, followed by a new decision of the Academic Council. Yesterday, the Executive Council was meeting when I came into this hangout, so I don't know what their decision is. These are the procedures a university is supposed to follow. At the end of all this, the UGC meets tomorrow, the University Grants Commission. They are the body that governs universities. They have a statutory responsibility to ensure the university is doing the right thing. I don't know what they will do, but that, I think, would be the appropriate last court. I think, frankly, right now, those who are upset about this 4-year thing want me or my Cabinet Minister Pallam Raju to intervene. Tomorrow, if we were to intervene on something else, they would say, why are you politicians abridging academic freedom? I think on academic freedom, my conviction is very strong. We must let the academicians handle education, and we must really confine ourselves to broader policy issues.
Charges is that procedures have not been followed in terms of these councils may have met, but you've had prominent academics actually speak up, professors from Delhi University.
Many have spoken to me, Sonia. Many have spoken to me.
So in that sense, the charge is that that procedure has not been followed. It's actually been railroaded through. That's why the ministry is being asked to intervene.
Well, as I say, we have raised this very question and been given very specific assurances with some details, I might add, as to the various processes of consultation that have taken place. Look, change is needed in our country, generally speaking. None of us can be in favor of being complacent about the way things are. When somebody turns around to me and said, you had a good education at Delhi University, how can you now agree to a change in the system that produced you? I say, well, that's very flattering. But the whole point is, as times change, so too should systems. So I am not opposed to change. And at the same time, I recognize that every change involves a certain amount of resistance. What I have said to the critics of this approach is, go and persuade the Academic Council that this should be opposed. if the academic council had said, we disagree with the vice-chancellor, there is absolutely no way the vice-chancellor could have got away with imposing a decision through a divided academic council. But when the kinds of votes we're getting out of the academic council are 88-6, you'll never get unanimity in our country on anything, you know that. But when he's coming up with those votes, very frankly, I don't see a realistic basis for me to say that merely because some of those who are critics of this happen to be friends of mine or college mates of mine or people whose op-eds I'm used to reading, that I should listen to them more than to the less well-known 88 professors who have voted along with the vice-chancellor.
Robert Mann, who's been waiting there. Robert, go ahead with your question.
Good evening, Minister. As a British expat working and studying in India, I'm very interested to learn about how the higher education system can foster creativity rather than rote learning. I see creativity as an important skill for young people to have when joining the workforce. I'd be interested in your comments.
Well, I agree with you entirely, Robert. This is very important. And in fact, it must strike you, having come from another country, when you meet a lot of Indian students, that in fact we tend to go the other way. A lot of our education, and I go well before the higher education stage, I go to the school stage, tends to be about preparing kids for examinations. That's been our culture. The examination is always the yardstick, the milestone, the goalpost. It's how you do well in the exam that matters. And the result is we actually fill kids, the teachers fill kids with facts that are relevant to take an examination. The problem is, of course, we don't really need to produce kids with well-filled minds, especially in the information era where you can get information with a click of a mouse. Instead of well-filled minds, what we really need are well-formed minds. Minds that are able to think, minds that are able to deal with unfamiliar information, minds that are able to grasp complicated issues and respond to them, because after all, the big examination called life tends not to ask you questions you prepared for, and tends not to skip the questions that came last year that you haven't prepared for. So the truth is that in that sense, preparing for exams, which has been the Indian educational culture, is a very unnatural way of preparing young people for life. So we are really strongly, and for some years now, moving in the direction of more creativity. The National Curriculum Framework, a landmark document which came out in 2005, has already expanded the scope for creativity to a very great extent. I would commend it to you. You can find it on the web. Google it, the National Curriculum Framework 2005. And then on top of that, what you've got is an increasing emphasis on using education to move away from, shall we say, regurgitating information for examinations to using it to prepare people to think for themselves. As I mentioned in response to an earlier question, the government is trying to push in this direction by putting in more money into research and innovation. The pending bill to create 14 new universities for research and innovation. But even within the existing universities, we want them to think differently. We are very keen, for example, to have in the existing universities collaborations beyond existing lines. So the concept of the meta-university, where you can construct a sort of discipline. If you're in Delhi, you can take a course at Delhi University, run a Jamia Millia, and combine the two to create a new sort of concentration which would be unavailable in any one of those two universities. That these are things, very honestly, that in our country we've not done sufficiently in the past, but we are now trying to open up that space. Even the much criticized Delhi University 4-year program will give much more flexibility to the student to choose courses, and our overall emphasis on increasing autonomy for educational institutions, that idea is intended very much to give universities the flexibility to create new courses, set their own syllabi, and frankly, let the students have a chance to have much more to choose from.
Well, let's go right across to Saurabh Tripathi, of course, very different perspective as an Indian studying in Nottingham. And Saurabh Tripathi, go ahead. Of course, we know that Indian students usually perform remarkably well, perhaps because of that parroting. It's a controversial word, but the parroting they've learned in the Indian education system. Go ahead, Saurabh.
Thank you, Sonia. Yes, I think they do. Dr. Tharoor, I'm an admirer of your work with the UN and as MP of Thiruvananthapuram. I follow your tweets and articles, and quite frankly, as an Indian, it's comforting to see public intellectuals such as yourself in our political system. In a recent interview with Rakhi Bakshi from Rajya Sabha TV, you mentioned that India's gross enrollment ratio is 116% at primary school, 69% at the 8th grade, 39% by 11th grade, and a shockingly low 18% at college or higher educational level. Having stated that, my two-part question to you is, firstly, what in your view are the reasons behind such a sharp decline in gross enrollment ratio across the various levels of education in our system? Secondly, what can the Ministry of Human Resource Development do to ensure that enrollment rates gradually improve? And as part of a bigger picture, doesn't this reflect the fact that students only look for an education rather than knowledge? If India is to grow at 8 or 9% a year, I think we need to build a knowledge economy, and it doesn't serve the purpose if 500 million of our youth simply hold college degrees. Thank you.
Well said, Saurabh. Thank you very much. No, that's a very relevant question. I must say for my sins that those numbers that I've been giving actually do conceal one important fact, which is that it's actually been improving. The numbers that I've mentioned are worrying, but they're actually better than they used to be just a couple of years ago. And we're seeing some real improvements. For example, at the primary school enrollment level, that 116% is amazing. We've actually enrolled more kids than we thought existed at that age group. Again, what's interesting there is that because we've got all these kids in, the number of out-of-school children in India has dropped below 3 million for the first time. Less than a decade ago, it was at 30 million. So we are actually now reaching more children, getting them into school. The challenge is in keeping them in school. Part of the problem, of course, is in the more poverty-stricken parts of our country, and particularly in rural India, that the domestic pressures on children to leave school and do other things, help the family out, work in the fields, weave carpets or sew footballs, whatever it may be, child labor, the pressure on girls to do domestic chores, to help the family with sibling care, and in some communities, even though it's against the law, to go in for early marriage. All of these things take kids out from class 8 onwards. So the dropout rates really start getting bad in class 8 and keep getting worse. Then, of course, there is the challenge of, many people feeling, what's the point in learning beyond class 10? Because we're not going to go off and do a job that requires a higher degree, so we leave at class 10, and that's why it gets worse by that level. We are trying now to create a number of incentives to keep children in school, and particularly children from the poorer communities, the economically disadvantaged sections, our scheduled castes and tribes. So we are, for example, very conscious of the higher level of girls that used to drop out in middle school and above. So one of the things we've done, for example, under the RTE, we brought in money for girls' toilets. Why? Because girls after a certain age have to have a place where they can change. If they go to a toilet and there isn't one, or there's one shared with boys, they will go home instead, and if home isn't next door, they won't come back. We lose a lot of girls that way. So toilets are actually an educational tool. Second example, there are girls who can't afford to go to school because of the pressures at home. We've now created a large number of girls' hostels. There's a thing called the Kasturba Gandhi Balika Vidyalaya, which is specifically targeting girls from disadvantaged communities, putting them there, fully paid for at government expense, to make sure that they actually study. Then when we get to the higher classes, we have all sorts of interesting initiatives. There's a national incentive scheme for girls, under which the government puts 3,000 rupees in the bank for a girl at 16 who's passed class 8. And she can collect the entire amount plus interest only when she's passed class 10 and reached 18. So we're looking at ways of actually giving people an inducement to remain in the school system. And of course, that has been working. We are seeing some improvement in these numbers. I do want to stress that nothing is guaranteed here, that people drop out for personal reasons that the government can't fully control. And even the RTE's real emphasis is 8 years of compulsory education till 14. Holding on to them beyond that is often a bigger challenge than we can legislate for. But these kinds of incentives to keep people in school make it more attractive. The midday meal scheme, for example, the government is feeding children. One of the reasons we're feeding children is because if school is the one place they can get a decent square meal, a nourishing meal in the middle of the day, that might be a good reason to come to school and stay there, right? So all of these are ways of ensuring that we have children remaining in school. And that's the objective we're trying to pursue. Retention. Now, you mentioned college is shocking low at 18%. I agree with you. The global average is about 28, 29%. We're certainly aiming to get there. But again, the problem is, of course, both capacity in colleges and trying to make it possible. One of the things that really frustrates me is that we don't have enough of a scholarship culture in this country. We don't have enough of a culture of educational loan. So I keep meeting or hearing in my own constituency stories of people who can't afford to pursue their dreams in higher education because they don't have the money that it takes to go and enroll in a college, stay in a hostel, eat, support themselves while they pursue a course of study. Now, those kinds of things are heartbreaking, and we need to do something about that. But we're doing our very best to improve all of these issues across the board so the right learning outcomes will follow.
Dr.
Thank you, Dr. Tharoor.
In fact, the other question again coming from Goonj, and this is Ashok Azad, who's from the Girid district of Jharkhand. His question, you already answered some of his question, because he's asked about how can we improve the infrastructure and quality of education in government schools. He makes the point, however, that the teachers and now are either on strike, they don't show up, and they're actually distracted by schemes you mentioned like midday meals or census or election duties. The studies of children are actually the last priority, and I think one indication perhaps is the fact that even in rural India, where daily wage workers are actually taking loans to make sure that children go to private schools rather than taking free education in government schools. So again, that's something, it's wonderful to have a scheme on paper, but where's the audit on how it actually functions?
Well, look, Sonia, the fact is that it does actually function. For example, the teachers are not supposed to be serving the midday meals. There is money provided for to actually pay for a cook and a helper and so on to do that. It's not the teacher's job. The teacher cannot and should not be using the midday meal as an excuse not to be teaching. Obviously, when the kids are eating, it's fine for the teacher to be there, but it's not the teacher's job, and we do not expect the teacher to take time away from teaching to give the midday meal. Similarly, absenteeism. To be honest, we hold the world record for teacher absenteeism. 25% has been the figure. Of course, our figures on teacher absenteeism are not 100% reliable, but from what we gather, according to surveys that have been done as recently as 2010, we're looking at 25% absenteeism in our government schools. That is unforgivable. It's also punishable. We need perhaps to devote more resources to actually making sure that teachers are doing what they're paid to do, which is to teach. And I might stress that government schools actually pay better than private schools, because our reforms that have brought in more incentives for teachers are actually have raised teacher salaries at school and colleges to a level that is actually rather decent by comparison with the past. So teacher absenteeism there is no excuse for, and we would certainly want it to stop. I can't pretend everything is perfect. We all know it's not. But we are aware of these problems, and we're trying to do something, like, as I said, ensuring the midday meal doesn't have to distract a teacher. Election duties, come on, it happens once every 5 years. Why shouldn't a teacher go out? Very often the election is actually conducted in a schoolroom. I mean, the booths are schools very often. And that's why the Election Commission tries to avoid clashing with a school examination cycle or anything, so that people can actually go to an empty schoolroom and vote, and the school teacher should be able to do that duty at that time. I don't really think that's an unreasonable demand in a democracy.
I have a question linked to that from Naman Srivastav in Gwalior, who sent in a text question. He asks that the Right to Education Act mandates that all private unaided schools need to reserve 25% of seats. The state government will reimburse these schools. But isn't the Indian government shrugging off its own duty of providing quality education at government schools by transferring that responsibility to private schools?
Not at all. It's a shared responsibility. Of course, government schools are educating people all the time. But we're saying to the private schools, you too have a social responsibility to take in kids from unfortunate backgrounds and give them some of the opportunities that your elite and affluent students are enjoying. Yes, the government will also reimburse the schools for a part of that, because we basically pay a fee that is what we consider reasonable, and maybe in some cases lower than the school actually charges a rich kid. But the fact is, we pay what the government thinks is right and fair, and we do it because we want other kids to benefit from this sort of educational opportunity. But I don't see this as transferring the burden. Look, a private school, under the very generous policies in our country, and a private college for that matter, has benefited from subsidized opportunities all along the way, whether it's land, whether it's subsidized tuition fees, whether it's various other central government grants. All of us who've come out of institutions that may not be government institutions should not labor under the illusion the government has played no hand in our education. When I went to St. Stephen's College, I still remember my monthly tuition fees were 15 rupees. Why? Because the UGC was paying for the rest of it, essentially. So every one of us in India has benefited to some degree or the other from the society, the taxpayer, the government contributing to our education, subsidizing who we are and where we are, I don't see why we shouldn't be giving back to society in the same spirit. And I think our private schools are part of this. They breathe the same air as us. They live on the same land. They share the same obligations to everyone in our society. And I think this is not asking too much that they should be able to do this.
But Dr. Tharoor, just taken that point, of course, your days in St. Stephen's College, many Stephanians would say today that if they applied in this current environment to St. Stephen's College, they wouldn't get a place, because given all the reservations, about 50% left, I think Chanda Bide had also raised that point, that people leaving because they can't get admissions into good colleges in India anymore. We hear that SRCC now wants a lottery system for its seats. The other big worry, of course, is when you have people like N.R. Narayan Murthy saying that the graduates coming out from some of India's best institutions, including the IITs, are unemployable. Those are issues that are not being looked at very seriously right now. Very seriously, we're looking at them, totally. As far as the first point you made is concerned, as I said earlier, the answer lies in expanding capacity. Right now, what is happening is a lot of the admissions decisions are being taken out of the hands of the colleges and essentially being dictated to by marks. In other words, because of various court rulings over the years, a place like St. Stephen's no longer takes people merely because they have a good creative talent, or they find debaters or actors or creative people or whatever. They only take people according to the cutoff marks that have been imposed. And I've questioned principals in the past of my own college when I've recommended good debaters or actors whom I've come across, and the answer they give me is, sorry, the truth is that if we were to even interview this kid when he's got 7% lower than the cutoff, under the court rulings, we'll have to interview the 15,000 other kids who've also got marks between his mark and the cutoff mark. We can't do it, so we'll never consider his application. Now, that kind of thing would be much, much less of an issue if we have expanded capacity across the country, as I said in my very first answer. Your second point, Sonia, just remind me very quickly, was it was a slightly different point you made. What was it? Mr. Narayan Murthy making the point. Yes, on the question of the unemployability. I have in numerous speeches said that we have 4 E's in education. Expansion, which was essential because the British left us with 17% literacy, 30 universities, just 4 lakh students. We've gone to 74% literacy, 600 universities, 20 million students. So expansion has been fundamental. Second, I said equity, which is of course essential because too many people in our society have been excluded by virtue of birth, religion, caste, race, gender from the opportunities of education. We've needed to bring them in. We've done a good job of that. In the process, I said we've not paid enough attention to the third E, which is excellence, without which you won't get the fourth E, which is employability. And I have been pushing, and the ministry has been pushing very hard to have much greater collaboration with industry to ensure that our educational system produces people whom industry is looking for. There's no point doing an engineering degree. What you're learning is irrelevant to any potential employer. But if those employers can interact with the university, with the polytechnic, with the IIT, whatever it may be, and tell them, look, these are the kinds of things we want your students to know when they come out, frankly, it's in the interest of everybody, including the educational institution, to do that, to provide that opportunity. And we want to see much more interface between industry and academia. Mr. Narayan Murthy himself, whom you mentioned, chaired a committee that recommended this, and we are very, very strongly and positively following his recommendations. So please get this right. These are very, very real priorities for us. We're not moving away from them, and we're not unaware of them. Well, we're drawn to the end of this hangout, so let's just go across to Neha from the YP Foundation. Neha ji, please, आप अपना प्रश्न पूछिए.
सर, हेलो सर, मेरा प्रश्न है कि हमारी कॉलोनी में 500 बच्चे हैं जो सिर्फ प्राइमरी एजुकेशन तक ही पढ़े हुए हैं, क्योंकि हाई एजुकेशन के लिए उनके पास पैसे नहीं हैं. जब हाई एजुकेशन के बिना हम जैसे लोगों को नौकरी नहीं मिलेगी, तो सरकार हाई एजुकेशन के प्रति क्यों नहीं कुछ कर रही? करना कोशिश कर रहे हैं हम, नेहा जी. बात यह है, पहली बात यह है, आपने प्राइमरी एजुकेशन के बारे में बोला, उसके बाद है हाई स्कूल भी है ना. तो हाई स्कूल के लिए हमारे ये सर्व शिक्षा अभियान के बाद एक राष्ट्रीय माध्यमिक शिक्षा अभियान भी है, जिसमें से हम प्रदेशों को पैसे दे रहे हैं अच्छे एजुकेशनल अपॉर्चुनिटीज देने के लिए. फिर उसके बाद हायर एजुकेशन का सवाल. हायर एजुकेशन के लिए हमारा एक डिसएडवांटेज है हमारे कल्चर में कि हम, जैसे मैंने पहले कहा था, स्कॉलरशिप्स बहुत कम देते हैं, एजुकेशनल लोन्स बहुत कम देते हैं. अब अगर अमेरिका देखें तो 70% स्टूडेंट्स एजुकेशन
एजुकेशन लोन से पढ़ाई कर रहे हैं, बाद में पढ़ाई करने के बाद नौकरी मिलने के बाद वो लोग पैसे वापस दे देंगे। इंडिया में सिर्फ 6% स्टूडेंट्स हमारे हायर एजुकेशन सिस्टम में एजुकेशन लोन्स ले रहे हैं। तो इस वजह से ये 6% के लोग पढ़ाई करने के लिए उनको ये मौका मिल जाता है, लेकिन बाकी सब लोग अपने ही पैसे से यूनिवर्सिटी जाते हैं। हमारे सरकारी कॉलेजेस में तो खर्च ज्यादा नहीं है, लेकिन हमें पता है कि गरीब लोगों के लिए कि ये 3-4 साल अगर आप यूनिवर्सिटी में जाना चाहते हैं, आपको कोई नौकरी नहीं है, आपको रहने का कोई मौका नहीं है, आपका हॉस्टल का पैसा नहीं है, खाने का पैसा नहीं है, तब तो जिंदगी बहुत बहुत कठिन हो जाता है। और सही बात है, हमने एक एस्टिमेट भी किया है कि करीब 20% या 21% लोग हैं हमारे देश में जो सिर्फ फाइनेंशियल रीजंस के लिए यूनिवर्सिटी नहीं जाते हैं, और हम चाहते हैं कि हमारे सिस्टम ये सब बदले। देखिए, हमारे मिनिस्ट्री की तरफ से हम लोन्स नहीं दे सकते, ये तो बैंक्स का काम है, लेकिन हमारी पॉलिसी ऐसे है कि बैंक्स को एनकरेज कर रहे हैं कि ज्यादा एजुकेशनल लोन्स दे दे, रिड्यूस्ड इंटरेस्ट रेट पे दे दे, कि बच्चों को यूनिवर्सिटी जाने के लिए मौका मिल जाए। आप जो कह रही हैं ये बड़ी जरूरी है, लेकिन एक और चीज भी बोलना है। आपने कॉलोनी के बारे में कहा, अगर आप SC ST लोगों के बारे में बोल रहे हैं तो मौका ज्यादा है फ्री एजुकेशन मिलने के लिए, और अगर SC ST नहीं है और इकोनॉमिकली वीकर सेक्शंस है, स्कूल्स में, हमारे गवर्नमेंट स्कूल्स में बिल्कुल बिना पैसे देने से भी 12वां क्लास तक पढ़ाई करने का पूरा हक है और पूरे पॉसिबिलिटीज है। इसलिए हम चाहते हैं कि जो प्राइमरी एजुकेशन के बाद रुके हैं वो लोग कम एटलीस्ट हायर स्कूल तक जरा पढ़ाई करें। गुड लक। और हम जब तक ये बच्चों कॉलेज से पहुंच जाएंगे, हम सिस्टम को जरा सा बदलना कोशिश करेंगे।
Dr. Tharoor, just one question. You of course are one of the pioneers of political use of social media, but have we looked enough at how we can use the internet in education? Because in a sense, the mobile phone revolution in India leapfrogged in many ways, and we've seen now that more people have mobile phones and they actually have toilets. Why can't you as education minister look at innovative ways to actually use the online media, something like the Google Hangout or other aspects to actually reach out to rural India and bridge that divide?
Totally, Sonia. We're not only looking at that, we are actually using ICT as much as possible, and we are encouraging, certainly at higher education level, the National Knowledge Network will connect all our universities to each other, and we're trying to get more schools connected through ICT. The problem in our country, very bluntly, is woeful infrastructure. What is the point of having a computer and a broadband connection? Not that they all have broadband connections yet, but what's the use of having it if you don't have electricity to run this? You know, I've often used the mobile phone example in my speeches even before coming into politics, and I pointed out what an extraordinary change there was, that we had waited for telephone lines to be strung across the country, with half the lines being stolen for their copper and sold in the market and so on, and non-functional telephone systems. We'd never have had a communications revolution. The advent of mobile technology that leapfrogged all this has, as you correctly said, empowered our country dramatically. We need a similar revolution in electricity generation as well. The day it becomes possible for everyone to have an affordable solar roof on their dish that will power their computers, and we don't have to wait for electricity wires to string together every village in our country, perhaps things will work faster. But right now, we're living in a country where in a state like Tamil Nadu, it's routine to have 14 hours of power cuts a day. And in towns, forget in rural areas, it's even worse. When in many parts of India, there are still villages that are not connected to the electricity grid, where power is not available, or when power is available, but there are cuts during the specific hours that children are at school or college. So unless we improve our infrastructure, this idea of using ICT to compensate for the lack of high quality teachers and information and material in the rural areas, that problem sadly will not be overcome until we can improve our infrastructure.
Dr. Tharoor, it's been fascinating really listening to some of the ideas, and I'm sure all the participants would agree your ideas, you're obviously bursting brimful with ideas, but of course you are hampered in a sense by the disruption of parliament. You'll blame the opposition will blame the government, and the perception that this is a government of scams. So there may be ideas, but with a scam a day being reported, is it perhaps better to just go in for early elections so there can be some movement forward? Currently, we seem to be stuck in a state of limbo.
Look, whatever the government may or may not be doing or being guilty of, the opposition's duty is to raise it in parliament. If they have a problem with the government, if they want to accuse the government of anything, if they want to argue against the government, They have been voted to a forum that is a platform for them to express these views. Their disgraceful behavior in disrupting the House, in not even allowing any discussion, is a betrayal of the very mandate they have been entrusted with by the voters. And I would like to see how these very same people can go back to the voters and ask for votes to send them to an institution called Parliament that they won't allow to function. Why do they want to come to Parliament if they don't want to use it for debate and for discussion? To my mind, it is a complete betrayal of democracy, a betrayal of the voters. Challenge the government by all means. Question the government. Grill the ministers. You know, question hour is ruined almost every day, and it's the one thing the ministers actually prepare for because they are accountable to the public through the opposition questions. Whether the opposition destroys question hour instead of questioning the ministers actually have a free ride. Why does the opposition want to give the government such an easy time? They should actually be taking their responsibility seriously. The problem is our politicians in the opposition are not responsible. They are betraying, as I said, democracy, but they're also disgracing the institution that they're elected to function in.
But Dr. Tharoor, the opposition has a completely opposite argument. The fact remains that Parliament was adjourned 2 days early. It's been, I think it's the lowest functioning Parliament so far. In this state of limbo, what's the road ahead? It's not that the government has given a roadmap of how they're going to either resolve this or move ahead with many of the bills that you talked about. I'm sure every minister has a similar list. How are we actually moving ahead? Which is why many ask that isn't this the time for elections if that's where this is leading? Where is this leading to?
But what is the point? I mean, frankly, if the elections are going to create a new parliament where whoever who lose are going to disrupt it, how is the nation's business being done? You see, the whole point of having an election every 5 years is to create a parliament that will debate, discuss, and pass legislation, make the policies that will then influence future generations. Now, if you're not going to allow parliament to function, how does an election resolve anything? To my mind, the frustrating thing for me is precisely this complete blindness to this obvious question. You know, why is it that you have a sort of zero-sum approach to politics and you say, I have lost the election, so I know that I can't win any vote against the government's policies and laws, I will therefore disrupt the House and not let it function until I win the election. What kind of logic is that? How can a democracy function on that basis? And frankly, to my mind, it's discrediting democracy in the minds of every thinking, educated, middle-class person in this country. And I must say, it's a very serious threat, because if democracy simply is not used to deliver the goods, and by the way, it wasn't like this always. Huh? There was a time when the opposition took its role too seriously. I still remember reading about a debate in which Atal Bihari Vajpayee, as an opposition MP, ended a very powerful oration with the words, "We have the arguments, you have the votes." He recognized that the government had the votes. He was going to lose the vote, but he was making the point to the nation that he had made compelling arguments that the nation had to hear. That's what an opposition should be doing. We have, remember, even in the days of Nehruji and so on, when there was no question of the government ever losing a vote, and where he himself had such extraordinary stature that everybody in every party used to admire him, even in those days there were famous opposition figures who came to national reckoning, who were respected because of the force of their arguments, because how they embarrassed the ministers by asking them questions, because of what they exposed on the floor. Instead, we have this. I mean, come on, Sonia, you can't tell me that shouting slogans in the well of the House, disrupting it, not letting the speaker speak, is a way of actually pursuing a serious agenda in this country.
Dr. Tharoor, of course, in Jawaharlal Nehru's time, you also had ministers, you had Lal Bahadur Shastri, who would resign at any hint of a question of a scam, who would take moral responsibility. The issue really is about the government's credibility, and you would know as you go out, really, I think, when you speak to various people, to various stakeholders about education, the focus now is on scams, the government of a scam a day. How do you restore credibility for support for many of these schemes you're talking about when the perception of the government is so clouded at the moment?
You know, it's very interesting when a television journalist speaks about perceptions, because you are the folks who create the perceptions. I mean, to be very honest, it's not as if there haven't been scandals in the past of previous governments.
Of course, but I think in this case, we have it falling into our laps.
Fair enough, fair enough. I read the newspapers too, just like anybody else. So I understand what you're talking about. What I'm trying to stress is you can't actually disrupt the functioning of democracy because there's any bit of wrongdoing in any portion of it. You know, when you say it's a government of scams, how many scams are there versus how many ministries, how many ministers, how many policies? And many of these scams, are they accusations? Have they yet been proven? What sort of, will they stand up in a court of law? There are a number of questions that need to be asked. the media and public opinion and the opposition parties cannot appoint themselves as accuser, prosecutor, judge, jury, and executioner all in the same breath on the same day. Frankly, I know what I'm speaking about since I've been there. And I did indeed resign rather than continue to offer fuel to this kind of nonsense process, even though there was simply no charge against me. I'm back now, and I have no desire to see others go through the same trial by fire and by media and by shouting that I went through just 4 years ago. I will leave them all to consider what is right for them to do and for the government to decide what it wants to do. It's not something that I'm directly involved in one way or the other. But I will say that one should not really arrogate to oneself the right to decide who is guilty, what they're guilty of, and what the punishment must be. I think there are processes in our democracy that should be followed.
Dr. Tharoor, thank you very much for taking time out. It's such a busy time to speak to all of us on this Google Plus Hangout. Thank you all the participants, and thank you for all those who tweeted us and phoned in. Thanks very much. It was great to have you with us.
Thank you, Sonia, and thank you all the questioners.